Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave, I am your man behind the screen, and on today's Dungeons and Discussions, we're going to broach a bit of an uncomfortable topic. We're going to be looking at the topic of sexism within the tabletop role-playing hobby. Now, as some of you may or may not be aware, recently, within the past, 10 to 15 years or so, this slow boiling idea has kind of come about that, at least among some people, that sexism within the hobby is an intrinsic thing, and that it's an absolute scourge that affects people all the time. Now, I've gone on record in the past as saying that I personally don't think this is true because in my own experiences, I haven't seen a whole lot of this. I've played with people from all over the world, as I've mentioned in the past, people of various backgrounds, both economically, ethnically, regionally, people of either sex, people of various race and religion. And never once have I seen this problem occur in the 23-odd years that I've been engaged in this hobby, where it hasn't easily been quashed by simply saying, hey, we don't find that acceptable at this table, please stop doing it. And in those instances where I heard that that wasn't enough, I've never heard of an instance where that player hadn't been kicked out. So, is the problem really as bad as some people would have us believe? Well, I was always inclined to say no, but I couldn't ever really say for absolute certainty because I only have my own experiences to go off of. So this idea has kind of mulled around in the back of my head for quite some time now, and personally, even as it mulled around, I didn't really buy into it, and I still don't. But I started thinking perhaps it would be a good idea to look into this. And I specifically started thinking of this because a couple of weeks ago, I noticed an unusual number of posts in one of, actually more than one, in 2 or 3 of the different Facebook groups I'm in related to tabletop gaming, relating to this issue. Relating to the issue of someone making inappropriate, lewd comments that made other players uncomfortable. Relating to this issue of DMs and GMs asking the community, or sometimes even just people as players, asking these communities, what would you have done in this situation? What could I do in this situation? How can we fix this? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find these posts again, since they mostly happened on Facebook, and they happened many weeks ago, and triple threat, since Facebook tends to randomize how posts are laid out, I scrolled through these pages for hours and hours trying to find these posts again, and I couldn't find them. But I can still tell you what I saw. I saw hundreds of replies, nearly 400 in the case of one post, wherein the overwhelming majority of these replies were that behavior was unacceptable. That's right. Men and women of all types, of all kinds of backgrounds, of varying nationality and personal beliefs, personal judgments, all of these individuals found this behavior unacceptable. Hundreds upon hundreds of them per each one of these posts. And in one of these groups, there were 4 posts about this within a span of 3 days. And every one of these posts got over 300 replies. All of them mirroring this same sentiment. We don't find it acceptable. You should talk to that player. If they're not willing to change, kick them out of the group. It sure seemed to me like people didn't accept this. Like there was a no-tolerance policy for it amongst the player base already, and yet I kept hearing people tell me stories or claim to me in the past, and sometimes in the fairly recent past, as in within the last couple of months, that this is an intrinsic problem, that just because I don't experience it doesn't mean it's not a huge problem, that just because I don't experience it doesn't mean it's not a scourge upon the hobby. So I'd been thinking for quite some time about how I might be able to show this, and I really do wish I had been able to recapture those original posts with the many hundreds of replies mirroring this sentiment in one way or another. Unfortunately, that wasn't doable. So I decided to go ahead and do the next best thing. Now, some people are going to balk at this because of the group I decided to go with. But nevertheless, I went with them anyway. And the reason why I know some people are going to balk is because I know for a fact at least one or two of my watchers is really not a fan of the Dawn Forgecast channel. They do not like Andrew. They have their reasons for this, and that's perfectly fine. But the fact of the matter is, I've been a patron of Andrew's for quite a few years now, and I've also been a member of this group for as many years as I've been a patron. So I've come to know these people pretty well. They are good people. They come from various backgrounds, as I've mentioned before, and many of them come from various places all around the world. We've got quite a few people from Eastern Europe. In fact, I know for a fact that one of the people who helps Andrew out a lot with his projects is from Eastern Europe himself. So I decided to pose the following scenario and questions to the Dawn Forgecast group, because I know for a fact, from personal experience with them, that they are a very diverse set of people with very diverse opinions who aren't afraid to share what those opinions are. I knew that I could more or less trust them to be honest with this. And I figured that I would probably get a certain string of answers that more or less related to what I got in those other threads, what I saw happening while observing these other groups, which, by the way, are groups that I've been a part of for many years as well. I'm not particularly active in them, I will fully admit. I tend to be more of an observer than an actual engager, largely because I don't use Facebook very much. But the fact remains that I have been in these groups for years. I have seen the way the people talk to each other, how they behave, their different thoughts and opinions, and these people are from various backgrounds and have varied personal beliefs and personal values. The same is true of the Dawn Forgecast patron group. And that's why I wanted to ask this group directly with the following scenario and the following questions. You're at the gaming table with a group, and one or more of the members has made lewd and or inappropriate comments in or out of character that clearly made one or more of the other members uncomfortable. For the sake of argument, we will say that the comments are overtly sexist in nature and come frequently, at least once or twice per session. Now, as I'm sure you've already figured out, the reason why I selected this particular scenario is because it directly relates to the kind of scenarios that were being posted about within these similar groups a couple of weeks ago. All of the posts that were being talked about in those few days were all about sexist players or a sexist player at the table making people feel uncomfortable and making people feel unwelcome. And so, I decided to also pose the following 3 questions. 1. Would you, as a player or GM, find this situation and or behavior acceptable at the table? 2. Would you take any action to try and curb this behavior, and if so, what? And 3. How common do you personally believe this particular kind of problem is across the whole of this hobby? Up on the screen now, you will see the answers that I got. Unfortunately, since I posted these yesterday, I wasn't able to get a whole bunch of answers, but as you can see from reading them, they all relate to the exact same kind of answers that I saw given in the hundreds on these other threads. I'm going to go ahead and read off a few of these answers, some that I think are particularly choice. As a general, I do not allow this behavior as a GM or like this behavior as a player. Such behavior is tolerated or is only accepted in certain games or groups if the GM allows this behavior for the theme of the game. I usually find talking to the player about their behavior will fix this issue within a calm and friendly fashion. If the problem persists, though, if the need arises, you can kick the person out for such behavior. As a trait, I have no data, but I believe it is more of a personality trait on an individual as much as certain personality tics are. Most of the time, I do not see this trait except for maybe 1 out of every 100 players that I come across. Unless you want to police the lewd behavior at your table, the best you can do is try to curb the behavior unless you want to remove this player for their lewd behavior from the table in order not to deal with it. Even under character, under perfect context, it's not cool. You need to tell them at the table, in that moment, the behavior is not okay. Then you also need to tell them outside the game, your table doesn't find that acceptable. I don't consider it a trait of the hobby as much as I do a trait of people in general. I have met sexist, racist, and prejudiced people in the hobby just as well as outside of it. I do think the hobby brings a pseudo sense of anonymity because the players can hide behind their characters. I have had to ask players to leave for both personal and interpersonal reasons, and it's usually because one player doesn't consistently, and not just as a one-off event. If the group has deemed this behavior unacceptable, as established and agreed upon within our session 0, then 'tis unacceptable. I would take them aside during a break or send them a private message if online. Give them a chance to correct their behavior before more serious consequences are required. The hobby certainly has its share of people who struggle with understanding social and group etiquette, who just don't have a lot of experience playing with others. It doesn't excuse this behavior, but such people can usually learn how to better get along with others. As far as the percentage of players like this across the hobby, that's going to be very difficult to get data for. But in my experience playing at cons and game stores, I'd say I've seen about 1 in 10 players with this sort of struggle. Many people have already answered, but I'll try to add where I can since I think I'm the first person of the female persuasion to comment on this thread. I tend to agree with a zero tolerance policy for this sort of thing. Lots of people have mentioned taking the offender aside and making your expectations clear, and that's great. In an ideal world, I would go further if the comment is severely inappropriate and call it out in front of all the other players. Sorry to stop, but I really don't want to have comments like that at my table, though I'm not sure I'd have the courage to necessarily do that in the moment. Acknowledging it publicly marks it as serious, and that lets the offended person know that you are standing up for them. For unclear situations, it may be better to ask the others first. One more thing. We don't always know when a person's comment is making someone else uncomfortable. I think it's important to make yourself approachable and even to check in with other players to make sure that they are doing okay with it. So far, I haven't personally experienced any situation like this because I stay far away from gaming tables where I sense this might be a remote possibility. For example, and I realize this isn't exactly the scenario above, but I do think it's relevant. When searching for a gaming group, I was once talking with a GM who let drop a comment like this during our first meeting. I never went back, and actually stopped seeking out gaming tables with strangers, instead creating my own group and inviting people I knew. So while I can enjoy the hobby, my concerns over this sort of thing did prevent me from participating in things like Adventurers League, etc., where I can't necessarily evaluate my screen and the group of players ahead of time. And lastly, if it occurs every so often, more as a slip of the mouth than on purpose, that's okay. If, on the other hand, it is clearly with purpose, and especially if it's to ruin the experience of another player, that is anathema. As a GM, I would establish right from session 0 that I'm not a fan of such comments. First, I would take the player making the comments aside and talk with him or her. If the comments continue, then I would confront the entire table with it, starting with something like, I do not like such behavior coming from one of my players because of reason X. Is everyone okay with this behavior being curbed or not? The peer pressure from the group could help pipe down the behavior of the player. Exposing them in the problem in public can and will be exposing for the player in question, but it will also address the fact that I, as the GM, want to have a group decision or verdict on this matter. If the table is not okay, and the player promises he or she will no longer do this, and again does it later, then I will have to kick them out. I could not say in terms of the statistics, and I will leave the statistics to people with far more experience and wisdom in those matters to myself. But I will say this. At my tables, such behavior never came up, both as a DM or a player. And I can say that I, by and large, agree with all of these sentiments. Unless it's the right kind of group, unless it's a specific kind of players that you know are okay with these sort of jokes or kind of comments, particularly a very personal group, like a group of old friends you've been playing with the whole time. By and large, in more public settings, with people that you don't necessarily know, it's not acceptable. Not a single comment here finds this behavior acceptable. And not a single comment on the other threads I've seen, amongst the hundreds of replies they got, found the behavior acceptable. So is this really the scourge that some people claim it is? All the evidence is pointing to no. It's not. It's not. So why does it persist? Well, that part I'm not quite so clear on. And while I do have my ideas, I can't really say for sure that they're factually accurate. However, I can say that there are things that can be done to properly curb this behavior in public and private settings alike. And we're going to touch on that next time. We're going to look at what I think are the 3 key things that players can do in order to really curb this behavior if you are in a situation where it is a problem. And be forewarned, some of my answers probably are going to get people of specific political events pretty upset with me. But you know what? I invite the criticism. If you've got ideas of your own, please share them with me in the comments down below. If you like this video and you like what I do here, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon. You can also open up the description box down below to follow me on my social media presences. Minds.com in particular is the best place to follow me if you want to get notifications about not only things going up on this channel, but other projects that I have in the work as well, such as my webcomic, Phoenix Rising. And, dear friends and gamers of all stripes, with this somewhat uncomfortable discussion now out of the way, my name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen, and I will see you next time as we start to dig into certain things that we can do as players and GMs to curb this behavior on the rare occasion that it does come up at the table.